So at Truth in Accounting, as you know, we do the financial state of the states and the financial state of the cities. And then when we did the financial state of the cities, we realized that New York City is our worst city. It has a lot of unfunded retiree health care debt. Their pensions are are funded better, a lot better than their retiree health care benefits. Those are very generous benefits, and therefore they have a lot of unfunded debt associated with that. But we also noticed that in New York City's financial statements, they include their school districts, their transportation districts, and their counties. Where when we went over to Chicago, Chicago wasn't as bad as New York, but then they were not including their school districts and their counties. So what we found is once that debt related to that was added to our what we call taxpayer burden, which is each taxpayer's share of the debt, that Chicago, if you include the state debt, was actually worse than the city of New York. So for example, and I'm going to look a little bit right, that's where I have the data today. For example, New York City's each taxpayer is burden in that city is $91,500, where Chicago's is actually $135,700. And we just feel that, taxpayers should, it's kind of, hey, we had to find it, seek it, spend hours and hours digging through what the governments call their underlying entities financial reports to find this hidden debt. Please keep in mind there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. You can click on that. Please put in your questions. So we want it to be audience participation today. We'll give you gold stars if you do participate. So please put in your questions. And I am so happy to be joined today by Patrick Tuohey, who is our expert today. He has worked in public policies for years. And since he doesn't like long introduction, I'll just say that he started the Better Cities project. And so I guess we'll start with that. Why did you feel a need to start that project? And I know you're going to talk about the importance of transparency to governments.
Well, thank you so much. And Sheila, I have been such a fan of TIA for years. I have relied on your reports to try to demonstrate to people in cities and the state where I live, Missouri, about the real danger of debt and lack of transparency. So I'm grateful for your work on our behalf. I'm on all of our behalves, and to be with you today. So as you said, I've worked in public policy for a number of years here in Missouri and spent a lot of time talking to cities, talking to state legislators about what the challenges were. And one of the things that I found is we spend an awful lot of time talking about the importance of local government, but then policy researchers often don't talk to the leaders of local government. And so my partner, Greg Brooks, and I identified that as a need. And so a few years ago, we founded the Better Cities Project. And our premise is that the men and women at the city level are the front lines of public policy. They are busting their butts to try to make cities work for all of us. And sometimes they don't have the time to go out and see what their peers are doing in other cities, what is working, what is not. And even if they did want to look for that, it isn't clear where they might go to find it. And so we try to collect the best public policy research out there and apply it to cities. We've written, of course, about housing. We're preparing reports on police reform, but really it's just to identify that certainly what COVID underscored for us was that cities have a great deal of power over our day-to-day lives. We tend to get distracted by state politics or national politics, but really it's the men and women around us in our neighborhoods that we rely on for well-working cities. And so Better Cities Projects wants to talk to them directly. One of the other things I like about talking about municipal policy is that it is often non-ideological. What matters is whether or not the streets are plowed, whether the potholes are fixed, whether the street lights are running and the neighborhoods feel safe. And so it is very easy to demonstrate whether policies are working or are not working. And that's another reason why transparency is so important. And then one of the things that's absolutely most important for me to want to remind citizens and local leaders is that nobody has a greater incentive in providing effective policies for cities than the people in those cities themselves, right? So the woman who runs the Public Works Department, she has every incentive to make sure the streets are repaired. And it's not just because it's her job, and it's not just because she has to drive on those streets, but it's because everybody on her block and in her social circle knows what she does for a living. When they hit a pothole and they see her, walking around the neighborhood with her dog or something, like, they might say like, hey, what's going on? And what's important for policymakers to understand is that those people face oftentimes a great deal of pressure, face obstacles that we're not aware of, to doing what they really want to do. We can't just assume that everybody who works at government is corrupt or inept. We've got to understand the circumstances in which they work and work through them, because I believe ultimately they want to help their cities. They want their cities to thrive, and kind of throwing papers at them isn't enough. We've got to meet them where they are. We've got to understand their struggles, and then we've got to speak directly to them with policies that affect them. And that is why I'm such a fan of TIA and transparency, because the first thing you have to do in order to solve any problem is to understand it. And oftentimes, we don't truly understand the problem or the scope of it. And I think with transparency, it's a good example of, it's not necessarily that someone has set out to obfuscate or hide numbers. It's just that as governments have become larger over time, as cities try to get involved in more and different types of programs, the patchwork we use to track those numbers becomes more and more difficult. And again, your reports are a testament to how difficult it can be. And it wouldn't surprise me if a lot of people at the city level, elected and career, don't themselves have a full grasp of where their city stands financially. So that's a little bit about BCP. Again, we observed that the work that people at the city level do is really important, and we ought to be coming up beside them and working with them and helping them help their communities.
Well, great. Well, thank you so much for promoting our reports and using those. We spent a lot of time digging through the numbers, and we appreciate you transferring those. I know you forward them to a lot of elected officials. So now there is a lot of discussion about the need for transparency. And what does that actually mean to this whole? There's a lot of quote meaning to our transparency. What does it mean to you?
So I think you're absolutely right. It can mean an awful lot. Some people think of transparency as making and responding to open records requests. Some people think of transparency as simply opening up a website that puts your checkbook on there, your financials, and those are important. Transparency can simply mean open records, or open meetings. And when you're negotiating contracts with public employees, those meetings ought to be open. And all three of those things are vital aspects to transparency. But I want people to think of it more as kind of a culture. So a culture of openness starts from the top, and it says, in order to provide the best service to the people we work with, our assumption should be that everything is open. All these meetings are public. I think one of the things that you realize when you first get elected to office, and I have never been elected to office, but this is what I hear, is that candidates run on one particular thing or two particular programs, and then if they win, they're suddenly presented with the vast complexity of a city, and there are all sorts of requirements of them that they don't come to with any background, right? So they may have run on public works or fixing potholes, but all of a sudden now they've got to deal with debt, right? Or they've got to deal with the pension system, and they don't have a background for it. And transparency can help them better understand what's going on in their own city. And I think when we kind of throw open the doors and let the sunlight in, we can benefit from the various expertises of the people in our city, just to kind of keep us accountable, but also to leverage all that knowledge among the public. But again, I understand if you're a city employee, transparency can seem like a burden. It can seem like just giving your opponent something to beat you with. And that's unfortunate, because there are so many aspects to transparency, which we can get into, which are positive. But I would argue that it's not just, again, an information response. It's not just a website. It's got to be an entire culture that starts at the top and permeates the entire city.
Yeah, I think so too. And some of the comments we're getting from our listeners is that there are often times where transparency might get people angry, because they haven't heard the truth before, and and it hasn't been. So I think that's where you're saying it can be beneficial to elected officials to be transparent right up front, because hopefully if something is being hidden, the public will eventually find it. And then if you haven't been transparent about it, then you will, then the public will be angry that you haven't been transparent.
So one of the studies I'm aware of, I think in 2014, looked at transparency in government and polled people about it. And what they found was that if a population believes that their government is transparent, it increases confidence. It increases the view that the city is, benevolent, even if those people aren't aware of that particular issue, right? So we want to know that government is open, even if we don't choose to pursue it. But I want to say I absolutely understand the frustration of local leaders, again, elected and career, because oftentimes people will say, well, how did you vote on this? We didn't know about this. And the people might say, look, we've been having meetings about this for weeks or months. We post them publicly. You didn't pay attention to any of that. And now that we're coming to a vote, now you want to slow down the whole process. So again, it's got to be both sides. I think a city can start off being transparent and being open, but the people have to rise to that occasion as well. But again, most people in our cities want to assume the best, want to go about their daily job, start their business, pay their taxes, and assume that government is running well. Oftentimes something contentious comes up and there can be these accusations, as you said. But another important part about transparency is it allows, well, it does two things. First, a study of the 2012 Recovery Act found that the biggest user of data, of transparency data and where the money was going, was actually government employees who used that real-time tracking of money to make sure that they were getting the results that they intended to. So it's a benefit to government employees themselves. And the other thing is, you talk in your report about pension obligations and retirement obligations that city has. Those career and elected officials have a stake in a well-run, solvent city because their retirement is tied to it. And so if they were aware that the financial state of the city that they are presently working in is threatening perhaps the solvency of their retirement, they might themselves be better stewards of programs of money. But again, too often what happens is We've built a complex kind of Rube Goldberg machine. We've clamped on all these different responsibilities, all these different activities. You talk in your report about cash accrual accounting, which kind of allows cities and states to get away with, I don't want to say fudging the numbers, but fudging the numbers. And so we've made it very complicated, even for somebody who on the inside wants to understand what's going on. So again, it's a benefit to, if you're a city employee, it's a benefit to you to be able to increase confidence of the people around you in your job. It helps you better do your job. And it can help you kind of protect your investment in the city's success long term.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, I am surprised that the employees are not more concerned about their pensions and especially their retiree healthcare benefits. The cities don't fund those benefits usually because they think that they can, change those and actually even get rid of them. And I think it's once the employees understood that, I think that they would be a little bit more concerned than I think they are. Do you have examples of how transparency, a specific example of how transparency has helped the city in your experience?
I suspect that when we were, last year when cities were dealing with their, COVID-related economic distress, and we're kind of looking at their numbers and making very difficult decisions about what to cut, what to grow. Anecdotally, I know a lot of them were kind of shocked by the state the city was in. And as you said earlier, nobody wants to be the messenger of bad news, but it's really important that cities kind of understand where they are. I'm thinking about what Anaheim is going through right now. Their mayor just resigned. There's a scandal about selling the stadium there and looking for kickbacks. Decades ago, Orange County went through what at the time was the largest municipal bankruptcy at $2 billion. But just a few years ago, Detroit went through an $18 billion bankruptcy. I think that although the financial decisions may have been the same, even with transparency, I think it is very likely that if the people and then the experts, reporters, journalists in the cities understood exactly what was going on, these problems could have been avoided. But again, we kind of see this now. We see that cities are hurting. We see that they're poorly run. The reporting process that you've talked about encourages, less than being completely forthright about a city's situation. And my fear is that we're all just kind of kicking the can down the road and making it somebody else's problem in the, once we're term limited out or once we've retired. And that's not healthy at all. The problem's only getting bigger.
Well, then why do you think that transparency isn't just the norm? To me, it would just be a natural, and especially I get concerned with our representative form of government, because without governments being transparent, then the citizens really don't have the knowledge they need to participate in their government. If they're told one piece of information, i.e. our budgets are balanced, then citizens believe that their cities or state must be doing fine. So they might advocate for a certain tax policy, right, or a certain spending policy based upon that fact. And then they might even go to the voting booth saying, oh, well, again, these guys must be being good stewards of our government. Right. The budget's balanced. Governor Newsom right now is running a huge surplus. Governor Pritzker is running a huge surplus. And when they go to vote, they'll vote based on that information. And then, perhaps later find out, they might have figured out that they have a surplus, but they really have tons of debt. So why do you think that the governments are not as transparent in these areas? And it's not the norm.
So again, I don't know that any of them over time set out to be opaque. But I think as city government and their responsibilities have expanded, as they've gotten into more and different things, the accounting has become more difficult. I think, as you kind of said, in a representative form of government, there are always a few people who have an interest in spending money, and you want to keep them happy. And the broader taxpayer base only sees a few nickels and dimes at a time. So, how many times have you heard the ad, for just the cost of a cup of coffee, we can, repave all our roads, we can improve infrastructure. And so the cost to you and me on the outside may just be, an eighth of a cent sales tax, but somebody out there is making a living on that. And so I think that may be part of it. The other part of it, I think, is I remember when I was in grade school and being told that I had to show my work on long division, and I resented it. What does it matter how I got there as long as the answer is right? And I think of that because I imagine that city workers, if they are asked to kind of demonstrate how they got there and show their work, they're frustrated because it's an additional burden of them to provide all those documents to demonstrate how they got to their assessment. I think part of it is a view of the public that, this isn't your expert, like kind of what I said earlier, this isn't necessarily your expertise. You kind of don't know about this. Just trust me, we'll take care of it. And then, in the worst cases, I think, like we're finding out in Anaheim, there are figures who are intentionally trying to hide and obfuscate costs or partnerships or relationships because it benefits them financially. And so again, if we start off with a culture of transparency where we assume that everything is going to be open, everything is going to be provided and easily accessible, then we don't necessarily require in the moment somebody to go back and show their work, right? Because they've been doing that all along. We don't tolerate opacity in government because it becomes apparent when we're not seeing something that we're accustomed to seeing. And it makes it all the more difficult for those few people who are corrupt or are trying to game the system, makes it more difficult for them to do so. And again, I just want to make the point that an awful lot of people talk about transparency in terms of combating fraud or corruption. Fraud and corruption, I think, are not big enough issues to justify transparency. Most of the people, again, elected and career at the city level, are busting their butts to try to do what we all want them to do, which is make our city better places to live. And they want to deliver those services efficiently and timely. Again, nobody wants to fix the roads more than the person who's in charge of fixing the roads. But over time, again, as cities have become more and more complicated financial organizations, that they have taken on more and different responsibilities, we've ended up with kind of a patchwork. We shift funds around, and that can become very, well, you write about what it becomes. It becomes very opaque. It becomes not very transparent. But again, it's not because there is an evil cabal in a smoke-filled room back there that's trying to ruin everything. It's just kind of a gentle process. And part of it are the voters who maybe have been told things are okay when they're not, or are too willing to believe perhaps that things are okay when they're not, who just think that local government can be everything they want it to be, when really the responsibilities and the duties should be very few, right? Fix infrastructure, provide for the public safety, provide for a court system, pick up the trash, plow the streets, and kind of leave it at that. And then let other organizations that can do things better do those other things.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, the complexity that they've become. And I think that's why, again, people don't pay attention because they're used to thinking of government is not, that big of an operation. I pay taxes, they do a few services, but I found, but governments seem to, because people weren't paying attention to them, seems to have grown and grown and grown. And the these underlying entities that we found in our combined taxpayer burden report, for example, the city of Chicago, I'm looking at their report, our report for them right now. You have the city of Chicago as a financial entity, as a corporation, but then they also have underlying government, the school districts, the transportation district, the park district is a separate entity that has its own debt, the water reclamation, the community colleges, the Chicago Housing Authority. All of these entities have been created separately. And I think some of it relates to where the government's Chicago might have had either you can't borrow, some governments have where you are limited to the amount that you borrow, or they go to the markets and they can't borrow anything, so that they open up these other entities, and therefore, so for special projects like housing, and we'll go ahead and have that entity borrow the money, and we'll give them taxing authority, and we'll have some control, but not quote complete control. So they'll be handled as a separate entity, but unfortunately, that makes it even more complex for the citizens to understand their finances, the government's finances.
I think of economic development incentives where well-meaning people can argue past each other truthfully. And it's because we don't kind of have a holistic understanding of how this money is coming in. People will say like, well, we're not using public funds. I'm like, well, you're allowing for this company to not pay the taxes they would otherwise pay, so that they can develop a project that you want them to develop. So it's not just spending money, it's money that doesn't come in the first place. You're absolutely right. We set up all these different agencies with vague rules or different rules that govern them. And then I think sometimes of a development that will take on bond debt. And, in Missouri, for example, municipalities are not allowed to take on long-term debt, anything more than a year, but they will say in these bond issuances, the city will pay annually as it can. And what they really mean to say is we are kind of accepting a long-term debt, but we can't commit to it. And so again, it's sort of like an off the books commitment that the city has made to this private development, which is not allowed legally, but it's sort of a wink and a nod. We'll take care of you. We'll be there. And so I don't even know how you would track that financially, because it's not going to show up on any spreadsheet anywhere, except when the development threatens to default on its bond payments, and the city then has to pick up those payments, even though it's not legally required to. So it is a mess. It is an absolute mess. And it's not just a matter, I think, and you're the expert on transparency and finances, but I would imagine that it's not just a matter of pulling together all the information that's out there, but it's a matter of saying, let's go back to the drawing board, guys. What are our terms? What do we mean by these terms? And let's stick to them and make accounting so much more easier, rather than, I imagine TIA, when you're putting these reports together, kind of running around the city from agency to agency, getting booklets and binders and running them back and trying to put it all together, it's almost too late when you're doing that. If the city doesn't have a standard, simple, agreed upon set of definitions and standards.
Yeah, and well, they do, and that brings me to one of our questions, where surely someone has pointed out that these issues exist, and the set of standards are set by the Governmental Accounting Standards Board, and have what is their position on should these governments be consolidated? Should the public know more about these? The Governmental Accounting Standards Board even has, if you look at city and state finances, they have the primary government, and then they have these discretely presented component units, which are also different authorities that aren't included in the primary government numbers. But that's how GASB has done their has allowed governments to do it. And it reminds me, when you were talking, it reminded me of an example where one of our supporters in a local town, Evanston, Illinois, where Northwestern is, called me and said, well, what is your thoughts about this lease management that the city's trying to do? Because they, in Illinois, there is debt limits for cities and how much they can borrow, but you have to go to referendum to the voters before you can issue debt. So the city went to the voters of Evanston to issue debt for a new school, and they failed. The referendum failed. So now what they're doing is they're doing this lease arrangement where they're going to lease the property from this lease manager organization. So they will have the building, but they will be able to circumvent this referendum process. Do you know any other? Have you heard of any other examples where they're actually leasing leasing things instead of buying things, so they don't have this large debt on their books?
I am sure every city, once the city attorney tells you, well, you can't do that because of this, then the developer, the people who have an interest in the project moving forward, are immediately trying to figure out their way around it. And one of the truisms, perhaps, in local politics is that a development attorney is always better at her job than the city attorney is, because they just have so much more incentive.
Right.
And that's no slight against city attorneys, of course, but I think all of them would agree that when the development attorneys come into their office, these people have thought through everything and have an answer for everything. So again, it's just the nature of the beast when you set up these huge municipal governments that have an awful lot of money, and the incentive is to spend it, and the incentive is to make those few people who are well connected happy. It's not unique to the United States. It's not unique to Chicago. It's just sort of like the nature of the human animal. And so I think the degree to which we can hold a light up to that and demonstrate that, and maybe then also expect less of our cities, right? Or at least ask them to focus on the 3 or 4 things that only cities can do, and leave the rest to private organizations. Is probably best, but maybe that gets into my kind of ideological worldview. I certainly think that whatever a city chooses to do, it's got to be open about it.
Yeah, and I do wonder, and you probably have stronger feelings on this than I do, of like, what are the cities and the park districts, why are they opening up health facilities, fitness facilities? Don't we have those in the private sector? Why are they opening daycare facilities? Do you think those are the type of businesses that should be left to the private sector, or should the governments be involved in those type of entities?
Well, those people, regardless of whether or not government should do it, those people are responding to public demand, and it's probably because the public isn't being told what the cost is. And so we've all been in a situation where we go to the grocery store and we say, oh, I'd like that. And you walk over and look at the price. You're like, I don't want it that much. We certainly do that, shopping for cars and houses. And so when the public says, gosh, we'd like this, I think it's perfectly reasonable for a city to say, okay, here are the trade-offs. We're either going to have to spend less on something we're already doing, or we're going to have to increase your taxes to pay for it. And then let the public decide, is that a set of trade-offs they're comfortable with? But, the easy answer is to just say, okay, we'll do that, and then try to deliver it. And maybe the voting public wouldn't want it if they knew the price, like the Evanston school, or maybe they would. But they've got to understand that there's a trade-off. And that's why starting off, I said this isn't just about local government and career and elected officials being transparent. There is a component of the voters understanding that all the things they want come with a cost and a trade-off.
Yeah, and we have gotten 2 questions, but I want to remind the audience members. So we are going to, one of them was anonymous, so we cannot give a gold star to that anonymous person. But another one, we will give a gold star to that person for asking questions. But if you do have questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. We'd be happy to answer those. I've kind of weaved the questions into our conversation so far. One question is, with the quote bailing out of the banks that were too big to fail during the all started with the housing market crisis, wouldn't it be argued that any large city or state is also too big to fail? So does it follow that the federal government is going to be bailing out when these governments start to fail? When these pension plans start to fail? I think the city of Chicago's police, you can go to Truth in Accounting's data-c.org website and look under our pension tab. But I think the last time I did that, the city of Chicago, one of their pension plans only has 19 cents for every dollar that has been promised of pension benefits. So this is going to fail, but isn't it too big to fail, just like the banks were too big to fail? So do you think that the federal government is going to step in and bail out these governments?
So the federal government, well, they already have. They've already sent billions of dollars to states and cities around the country. So it's not a matter of absolutes anymore. It's a matter of degree. We've already crossed the threshold. We all watched a lot of municipal governments make very difficult decisions when they anticipated an economic hit from lockdowns, from the pandemic. They did a lot of hard work and made a lot of tough decisions. And then the federal government came along and obviated the need for all those tough decisions. And so, if it didn't make them whole, it certainly helped cover their losses. And I think what we all instinctively understand is we papered over a lot of bad decisions. Cities, we say this of big business. Big business makes bad decisions. Small businesses make bad decisions. The best thing you can do is let them suffer the consequences, because they will be more conservative, more intelligent next time. Cities are no different. A lot of them have made really bad decisions. They have chosen not to fund their obligations. They have chosen to defer maintenance on infrastructure. And while we don't necessarily want populations to suffer from those decisions, we have got to make sure that that decision-making gets better. And so my fear is that as a result of the bailouts we've already seen, and likely future bailouts, that bad decision-making at the local level will be rewarded, not just tolerated, but actually rewarded. And if a local politician thinks, I don't have to fund these pension obligations, because when it gets bad, I know the federal government is going to come in and bail us out. That is really bad. That is really bad for government management at every level. And again, it's not a matter of whether, I think, because we've already seen the feds bailing out cities.
Yeah, and during I believe it's a part of the American Rescue Plan, they bailed out union-run private sector, like the truckers' pension plans. Why is a private sector trucker, why should their pension plan be bailed out, but not a Chicago City police officer's pension plan?
Well, when the day comes that Chicago City police officer will be testifying in front of Congress making that exact point. And I don't think members of Congress will be able to resist the urge to bail them out. So it is unfortunate precedent, but I think the precedent has been set.
Kevin, and again, I apologize if I don't say his name right, Bessler is asking, how can Chicago make things better for the taxpayers? He's with Illinois Radio Network. Can you think of specific things that Chicago could do to make it better for each taxpayer so they're not in all this large debt?
Well, again, I live in Kansas City, and one of the things I struggle with is, if a city wants to make bad decisions, who am I, living across country to stop them from doing it? There are some cities that are going to vote.
I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I would say you just made the point that there is because
Right.
If the federal government's going to come and bail them out, then yeah, you should be involved in that decision.
Yes, no,
And-
you're exactly right. So my answer to Chicago is the first thing I would want Chicago to do is understand exactly where they are. Chicagoans should understand exactly where they are. What are their concrete obligations? Of every dollar that come in, how much of it is, already spoken for, which by the way, is one of the fascinating things in, if you get involved in any kind of city talk about, we want to spend money on this, is when the city manager or somebody in finance says, look, we don't have the X amount of dollars you think we do, because 80% of it is already committed. That's not flexible spending. We actually have much less say over where we're going to spend money. But the first thing Chicago needs to do is absolutely understand where they are, and publish. The city itself probably needs to put its imprimatur on a report that says, here's where we are, here's how bad it is, and then here are 3 or 4 options. And the people of Chicago can decide if they want a robust, many-headed government that provides all sorts of services, some that you pointed out may be available in the private sector, but if they want a robust big government to do all these things, that's fine, as long as they're prepared for the trade-offs, right? Either the cuts in services elsewhere or the increase in taxes. That is up for Chicago to decide. In Kansas City, when we are given that same report of how Kansas City is doing, we may be much more likely to recoil and say, oh my gosh, we're doing too much. So I think we can allow every city to act differently. And certainly Chicago has demonstrated a different set of priorities than Kansas City or elsewhere in the country. But that first inescapable step is to understand exactly where we are and cut through all these kind of, sleight of hand accounting tricks or kind of off the books, off to the side things, and say, here's where we are. What kind of city do you want us to be? And I imagine a lot of the people who would otherwise ask for more and greater city services, when presented with that information, would understand, like they do in their own life, oh, we can't have those additional things, or maybe we need to give up on these other things because we really have to make sure that the city is here and solvent in 10 years, in 15 years, in 20 years. So that's not a satisfying answer, but I think every city needs to really embrace where it is.
And that's why we do the financial state of the states and the financial state of the cities. And again, people can look at our data-z.org and, select we only do the 75 most populated cities. If you want your own city done, if you're not included, you can contact us and we can talk about doing a custom report. But what we find is when we present these numbers to elected officials, they are usually like, well, those pensions, we don't owe them right now. And it's like, well, yeah, it's like a credit card balance that you do owe right now. And they're like, well, we're going to pay it off over years. And it's like, well, yeah, I might not pay my credit card off right now, but I'm deferring the payment, but it doesn't mean that I don't owe it right now. Right. And so I think that's what, I think the most outrageous example right now is, again, Governor Newsom, who is sort of going around, we have this, the largest surplus in history, but they have more than $264 billion of debt. They're not even pre-funding their retiree healthcare debt. So the true cost of government is not included in the budget. And so they can pretend that they're balancing their budget. And that's why we propose fact-based budgeting, which is this full accrual calculations and techniques. You have to include all the costs that you're incurring, not just so, oh, we're going to pay that later so we can kick the can down the road and we can spend money now. And so I guess one of the somebody else is saying in relation to the federal government that the federal government for the purposes of bailouts is a conduit of taxpayer dollars. But, you know, should a taxpayer in, let's say, a state that is being rail one, like Utah, should a taxpayer in Utah be required to, you know, fund policemen's pensions here in Chicago when they've gone ahead and funded their pensions correctly, but the city of Chicago hasn't?
Well, that's where it's going to go, right? The well-run cities, maybe the smaller cities, maybe the cities that are less mature, right, aren't as old, are going to start to resent bailouts like these. Why are we being punished for your misconduct? And we see that already, that kind of flavor of argument in all sorts of policy discussions. But again, you know, you talk about the public official who says, well, you know, we don't have to pay those now, we'll pay them in the future. And I almost kind of want to open the books to him and say, look at your payments in the last 5 years. Why do you think the future is going to be different than the past, right? Where is this additional commitment? But what they mean is, well, that's somebody else's problem, right? That the future, they'll deal with that. It's not my concern right now. Right now, I want to give out goodies and hand things out to people. So again, the public needs to be aware of that trade-off. And I can easily see a situation where well-run or smaller or newer cities without all that kind of decades of deferred maintenance say, no, we don't want to help you. In Missouri, and I'm sure in every state in the union, there already is this type of rural or suburban, I'll say hesitation, but suspicion of St. Louis and Kansas City. You know, we know you guys are poorly run. We moved out of the city to get away from your tax policies, to get away from your problems. We have no interest in supporting you if you guys can't get your books together. I can imagine that becoming a national problem. The irony is that New York and Chicago, Los Angeles, Atlanta, all these huge cities are amazing hubs of innovation, of technology, of culture, of wealth, of industry. They can fix this. They can absolutely right the ship at their own municipal level. They just have to be given the incentive to actually do it. The incentive right now is like you said, look the other way. Don't worry about that. We'll take care of it. But I think all these cities that are having the problem are more than capable of fixing it. They just need the political will, and they just need the people to understand what's at stake. And so I can imagine a mayor coming in and saying, you know, we need to fix these problems so that we can benefit in the long term. And see, by the way, and it's not just a matter of fixing these problems in the short term, but if you fix them in the short term, you're clearing out all the obstacles to economic growth in the future, right? People can build more easily. People can invest more easily if the city isn't having to deal with all this horrible debt and deferred costs. So it's not just a matter of a short-term problem. We can fix a short-term problem and see long-term gains, but we need the will. And right now, as we've said, there's too much incentive to look the other way and just to deal with what's immediately in front of us.
Well, and I think by not being upfront with the public about their true financial condition, and you know that, hey, we're not even setting any, you know, these employees are earning these retiree healthcare benefits. It's part of their current compensation package. We need to currently fund those. Would be the fiscally responsible thing to do. But then when you get into a political environment, it's like, well, yeah, but putting money into a retiree health care plan versus other politically popular programs, you might have somebody who, let's say that you're elected, to the mayor of Kansas City. You might go in and go, oh, okay, we need to, do these fiscally responsible things, but then you're not going to be able to give as many goodies away, politically popular things. So then, you'll have people run against you who don't care about that.
No, that is, you talked about at the beginning of kind of the challenge of our representative system, and that is exactly it, is that we will elect people who will soothsay and who will give us what we want, and it's not what we need, and certainly in the long term, it's damaging to us. I spoke to a friend here in Kansas City a number of years ago who had been an observer of Kansas City politics for decades, and I told him, you should really consider running for mayor, and his answer was, I don't think there would be enough public support to do the things that I think this city needs. And I imagine that's true in every city, that the bean counter, right, the person who understands what's going on in the city observes that exact situation. I can run, but who's going to want to vote for somebody who says, tighten our belt, we've got to fix this? It's just not an attractive message. It's a necessary message, and it's absolutely a necessary activity that government needs to undertake. But I think until people realize the dire situation that their cities are in, they won't be ready for those trade-offs. And so we need to have an honest accounting. And unfortunately, with the federal bailout, the federal money going to cities, we are further away from a realistic look at our cities than maybe we've ever been.
Then aren't we setting ourselves up? I just kind of think with Chicago, Illinois, and other cities that because of the political structure, because how bad they are, is it not just going to take crisis? Is it? I don't see them sort of going, oh yeah, I see them tripling down. It's like, we got federal money, let's use it, to give other more politically popular things away. Not, here they're, and I think it's, they're doing gas tax holidays, and it's like, yeah.
Well, wasn't it your former mayor in Chicago who said, never let a crisis go to waste?
Yeah.
I think so. I think but maybe it requires a crisis, but then it also requires us rising to the occasion. So the pandemic was potentially a crisis that could have allowed a lot of cities to right their own ships, to come face to face with their challenges. But yet the federal government, I'll say, took that opportunity away from them. I think of the New Orleans school system, which was burdened with so many problems, yet as a result of Hurricane Katrina, a crisis, was really able to use that moment to kind of start from scratch, literally, physically, and build a school system that really served the needs of the students there. But it was because they were given a crisis and they took advantage of it. So as we've seen from the pandemic, a crisis isn't sufficient. It may be necessary, but there is no replacement for candidates and career leaders to have spine and to stand up and say, we can't keep doing this. There's no magic wand.
I would push back and say that they need to have the spine to tell the public the truth of the current financial situation. But I think also it should be, the citizens and the voters should sort of go, hold it, we're in a horrible situation. I really,
right.
We can't afford these things. So I'm not going to vote for a candidate who, gives me all of these things. Barrett Peterson, who is one of Truth in Accounting's continual supporters, is highlighting that, the current payment of payroll taxes, like, Social Security and Medicare, those are normalized in government and cities' budgets, and the pension payments, the funding of those should just be normalized as those payments. One question we have is from Justin Carlson. Again, each one of you are getting a gold star when we get done. Says, why do you think there is so much resistance to the idea of municipal bankruptcy in general? It's not unprecedented. Detroit went through it recently, as you mentioned, but it seems like there's a huge fear about it, and that makes a federal bailout somehow more appealing than simply forcing the offending municipality to make those hard choices they neglected for years by going through the bankruptcy process. Do you think that government should be more open to going through bankruptcies?
So the short answer is, I don't know. This is not my area of expertise. Having said that, I am interested in learning about this. My partner and I talked about this last night. This may be an area we want to discuss, exactly because the people who are working in cities should understand that they have a financial interest in their own city's solvency long term. And so maybe they should be the conservatives, right, who are saying, do we really want to take on this additional responsibility? However, and I'm speaking from ignorance, it may be through state law, city law, through contracts that unions have made sure that pensioners are first in line. I think that may have been what happened in Detroit. So it probably is going to require a lot of reform. I don't know that I have a problem with municipal bankruptcy in general. I think everybody who deals with a city maybe should say, I want a good deal, but maybe I don't want too good a deal, because I don't want, I don't want to lose even a moderate deal. I want to make sure that I'm paid. Ultimately, it is important that everybody understand that we all have a very real stake in the success of our cities. We shouldn't expect the federal government, or the federal government shouldn't be coming in and removing those mistakes. We should understand that because we've got a financial stake in the city, we have an interest in it working. And I think a bankruptcy law may be a part of that. But again, I'm out of my depth on that issue.
Well, one thing that Andrew Biggs and I wrote about this in the middle of COVID is, and we anticipated the federal government in essence bailing out the cities and states during COVID, is that state corporations have to follow ERISA, the employer retirement, whatever those initials mean, a federal law, and they technically have to fund their pensions properly, include these numbers, the full cost in their income statements. And if they don't, then, the federal government steps in. So unfortunately, there was one line in ERISA that said, hey, this doesn't apply to state and local governments. Well, the question is, should it apply to state and local governments? And then second, it's like, well, you can't mandate things for state and local governments. But what Andrew Biggs was saying, who's on the Puerto Rico bankruptcy board, said that, well, if, just like, okay, states follow the 55 or 65 speed limit. And they do that because if they don't, then they lose federal highway money. Well, if you're giving money to the states right now, wouldn't it be better to have a string attached to that if you want this money, you're going to have to start living up to ERISA and properly fund your contribution pension plan, properly account for your pension plan. What do you think of Andrew's idea on that?
I don't have a problem with a mandate on reporting methods or reporting standards. Again, cities and states can be free to take on any responsibility that they want to, whether I think it's a good idea or a bad idea. but they should be held accountable for reporting it. And I think what TIA provides all of us around the country is a standard way of comparing and contrasting cities and states that is hugely valuable. And so I think the federal government would be fine to mandate reporting standards. Again, cities and states are free to adopt any policies they want, but they've all got to talk about it in a certain language, the same language. I think that would be fine. And by the way, I take road trips with my daughters every summer. You talk about speeding limit when the federal government said you don't get transportation dollars, which I think ended in like 1994, but I cannot believe that we were all required to drive 55 at one point. Going through South Dakota, it just seems crazy that was ever a thing.
Yeah. I just think, we need, something needs to be done. And unfortunately, gosh, this has been such an interesting conversation that time has flown by and we've run out of time. I will note the people who've asked us questions, so we get their gold stars. And we will send you also a gold star for being our expert. But thank you very much. People, if you want to learn more about Better Cities projects, go to their website, go to truthandaccounting.org or data-z.org to get our latest report, the combined taxpayer burden, how much each taxpayer is on the hook for each cities. But again, thank you, Patrick, so much for joining us. Thanks to the audience for joining us. And we look forward to seeing everybody next time.
Thank you. Take care.